Hello, my advanced GISers. Welcome to Chapter 12, How to Use Raster Data. I am doing a recorded lecture for your benefit because I think this is a very important concept to learn, and it is what the rest of our book and stuff we'll be studying this semester is based on. So I wanted to establish a good groundwork for this. So this week we are delving into the use of analysis and imagery in GIS. And today we'll start with the basics, understanding raster data. Why? Because any imagery that is analyzable in ArcMap is in this form. So not necessarily bacon and eggs with sunglasses, which would be pretty awesome, but we are looking at pixelized imagery, or the concept of the pixel. So this is a raster. It's a square, and it's a square that contains lots of data. It also contains geospatial data, which is why it makes it specific to our purposes. Rasters, when they are put together, here we see different views of the same raster image, sort of kind of zoomed out, a little farther in, and then further in, and we see a lot more of the graininess in the squares. But put together, rasters create what is called a continuous field view. We'll go back and discuss continuous field view a little later in this presentation, but let's just say for now that continuous field view is probably best understood in opposition to vector data, which is about discrete phenomenon, buildings, streets, roads, etc., lakes even. But when we're looking at raster data, we're looking at phenomenon across a spectrum, or in which case across an image. And in this case, in these pictures, we're looking actually at land cover. So these different colors we see here represent different land cover types. And this is considered continuous phenomenon, or continuous field view. So let's look at this raster concept a little more closely, and a little more generically. If you've ever zoomed in on a picture and you go from this beautiful clear photo to these multicolored squares, this is the same thing as raster imagery. I mean, this is called a raster. And it has the same qualities because it has a color number attached to it, which is also what we deal with in ArcMap. What it doesn't have is geospatial data. It is not projected. So this image does not have a geospatial location, whereas everything that we deal with in ArcMap actually does. So even down to the raster/pixel has a geospatial location. So let's look a little bit at the raster data model, and what is meant by that is how do we actually analyze all of these squares when they're put together? Well, all of these squares put together create a nice tidy blanket of tiles, and they're considered, like very simplistically of course, rows and columns. No big concept there, and we can also think of it in terms of X and Y axes. And rasters are read from right to left, and every single raster excuse me, has one value attached to it. Okay, sorry, I had to cough. So every single raster has a value that it is labeled as, and this value represents the kind of light that has hit that raster has collected for that, or the camera has collected for that particular raster. And when we look at a grid, we'll see that variety of different patterns. I mean, it depends on the image, but there will be groupings, there will be single tiles, but everything represents the kind of light that has hit the camera at that particular raster level. Ways we can actually read rasters, we can actually look at it and as a list of cell values. So in this case, what we see down here, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 4, 3, actually corresponds to what's up here. So if you read this from right to left, going down and down, you would actually read it off like this. Now, the one thing I think is very important here, and we'll again get into it a little more detail later, is how this raster information is expressed in an attribute table. You can see here this is nice and tidy and small, and yet we're looking at a large amount of rasters, because if we were to add up all of these rasters in an image, we would have hundreds of thousands of them. But in this case, I'd like to point out that what we're dealing with here is 15 different kinds of rasters. So we have our object IDs 1 through 15, and each of those 15 represents this value. Now this value actually corresponds to what is called the National Land Cover Database and means a different kind of land cover, and we'll actually see this a little later in the slideshow as well. And what's happening when we're looking at this coordinate space or this grid location is every time the number 11 occurs, or let's even say the number 4, say instance down here, it counts it in the image that we're analyzing in ArcMap, and we get the count of it here. So in this particular picture that this attribute table was based on, the number 11, the value of 11 occurred 32,688 times. So you can see we're getting pretty high numbers here, and it has a lot of implications for our processing that we'll discuss later. And I'd like to just point out right here, this isn't going to actually play much role in this lecture, but it is possible for a raster to have no data in it. That does not mean 0, it means actually no data, and it doesn't get counted. This will come into play a little later as we analyze more complex raster scenarios. So what is it that rasters actually represent? Well, as I pointed out earlier, the most important thing about rasters, well, I suppose there's two important things, but for our purposes, the most important thing is that they actually represent real world locations and phenomenon. They are projected, they have a coordinate system, so you could actually take a single raster and find it on the Earth. But this all came from the remotely sensed data that was gathered by a satellite, camera on a satellite. So if you think back to your GIST class, you might remember how satellite data works. And we'll go over that briefly in a little while. Another thing that's important to remember about what rasters represent is they actually represent not just a location, but they actually represent physical space and a real world dimension on the Earth. So in many cases, we'll be dealing with 30-meter resolution, which is quite common. And what that means is that that square that you're looking at on that picture actually represents a square on the Earth that is 30 meters by 30 meters, which is equal to 900 meters square. So if we look at this grid cell here, we see that it's 8 by 8. And if we accept the fact that each square is 30 meters by 30 meters, or 900 meters, how much area does this image hypothetically cover? Well, if we do the math, 30 meters by 30 meters, 900 meters square. If we multiply 900 by the product of 8 times 8, we get 57,600 meters square, represented by this grid. And to make that more real, that 30 meter by 30 meter grid is actually equivalent approximately, pretty close actually, to the size of the Family Dollar that is in Lander, near Lander Center. So that's it right there. So again, when we look at that, when you think about looking at that National Land Cover Database imagery that we'll be dealing with a lot, those squares that you see are actually that Family Dollar. So I think that's pretty cool. So just to back up briefly and look at what's actually happening with our colors and our values and how they're represented. Again, I know this is all sort of review for you, but it's important to remember that when the remotely sensed imagery takes a picture, it's actually bringing in a numeric representation of the predetermined raster resolution size. And what that sensor is reading is the amount of reflected light from the surface, which translates into a number called a brightness value. And the amount of values produced depends on the kind of sensor that's being used. We typically see 8-bit imagery, which produces brightness values on a scale of 0 to 255. And these 8-bit images, which are grayscale, get shot through a color gun to either red, green, or blue. And the corresponding light to dark pixels become then different concentrations of lighter to darker shades of red, green, or blue. And then when you combine these different grid cells of projected red, green, or blue shades and layer them, you get composite colors. So as we see in our example down here, we have our grayscale, and then each different shade of gray, or white to black, has been translated into a brightness value over here. And then when we put it through a color gun, we can get our RGB value. Let me add, of course, this is a rather gross oversimplification of a rather complex process, but just gives you the idea that there's a lot of processing happening of these satellite images that we're analyzing. So this slide is just to show you a little bit, an overview of the National Land Cover Database. I've mentioned before, we're going to be working with this data a lot. This picture you see here is actually of North America, obviously, and this is North America as all of the different kinds of land cover classification shown through a processed image. And over here on the right, you can see the land cover classification legend. This applies to all National Land Cover Database imagery. We will be using these categories in our labs coming up. And these have been determined by the clever scientists over at the National Land Cover Database, where they do take the information in. So I find this stuff very fascinating, and I look forward to having you guys play around with it a little bit more. So let's go back to our raster. One of the things that I think is really important about rasters, and that is going to be critical to understanding how they work and to doing the work with rasters as we move forward, is that rasters are not just static. They actually talk to each other. I call them friendly rasters. They're very communicative, like our prairie dogs. One of the things that I like to highlight, or that kind of, I think, brings that point home, is the fact that when you're running geoprocessing tools with rasters, you often will ask, how many neighbors do you want the raster to talk to? In this case, we either have 4 or 8 neighbors. So when a raster talks to 4 neighbors, it talks to the ones north, south, east, west, or up, above, below, right, and left. Or it talks to all 8 neighbors all around. And when I say talk to, it means that it's running mathematical processes on the numbers that are either 4 or 8 around that single center raster. And the kinds of math that's happening depends on the sort of geoprocessing tool you're running. And briefly, let's look over here at grouping and grouped attribute tables. This is just another way that raster data is sort of, I wouldn't say manipulated, but you can sort of take it, change, like group things, relabel them. It's called reclassifying, and create backlinks to information. So it's kind of, we'll be coming across this in a few further chapters down the line, but what's happening with rasters is because you can actually reclassify them, but you still want to hold on to the old information even after you've sort of transformed the raster data into something else. It's called creating backlinks, and one of the ways we do this is through grouping. So this is just to say that there is a lot of capacity with working with rasters, and I think they have a lot of cool stuff to offer us. So this is just to highlight the difference, again, between raster versus vector data. I'm hoping you sort of have it kind of clear what's going on here. With vector data, again, we're looking at features that have discrete characteristics, and the difference is that these discrete characteristics have a shape. They have they can be polygons, points, or lines, and each of those shapes can have a variety of non-geospatial data attached to them. When we're looking at raster data, all we're looking at is a square, a raster, a pixel, that has a classification, a number attached to it, and it has a spatial resolution and a geographic coordinate system attached to it. And that means that we can then, we're not so worried about what each individual raster is doing, we're worried about what the rasters are doing as a whole and what that represents. So with vector data, we're worried about the individual points, lines, and polygons, where with raster data, it's all about what the group is doing, the continuous phenomenon. So this to me is kind of like the magic point of talking about rasters versus vectors. The difference is in the way the attribute tables look. So when we're looking at vector data, we have attribute tables that are just super long. There's so much information. You have to scroll, 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 and there's all these null values, and you're like, what's this? And I don't know. They can be quite overwhelming. Lots of cool information, but sometimes, like, it's hard to know what's going on. Whereas if you look at the attribute table for a raster, it's super simple. Like I said before, you have the object ID of how many different kinds of values there are. Then we have the values that are represented, and then we have the number of times they occur. But here's the clincher. When we start doing geoprocessing tools on rasters, the computer is all of a sudden being asked to do a lot more complicated mathematics. And it's processing super high numbers, like very large amounts of numbers, and lots of calculations are happening. When we're asking ArcMap to run analysis on vector data, it's not nearly as complicated. Despite the fact that these tables are huge, the math is really only occurring on some rather much more simplistic level. We're asking it to do some sort of basic spatial analysis or some buffer, and it just isn't as complicated as running the raster geoprocessing tools. And this is important to remember, because when you start running these tools and doing your labs, you'll find that raster data takes a lot longer to process. So you kind of have to be patient with your computer, because it could actually take sometimes 5, 10, 15 minutes for something to finish processing. I'd like to just quickly highlight here that raster data can actually be further stitched together to create even larger images, and it can also be clipped using a mask to create a subset. So when we're looking at our raster imagery that we download from the National Line Cover database or whatnot, we can actually further manipulate the shape to create something larger or smaller depending on our needs. And last but not least, as we prepare for the lab, I'd like to just note that to remember that raster data, like everything in GIS, has to have a projection. So remember to pay attention to transformations and that things are lining up. Don't forget to enable Spatial Analyst. This is where we start getting into like common errors that occur when doing labs in Advanced GIS. Don't forget to enable your analyst, your Spatial Analyst, or your other analyst that you might need to have enabled. Also, be sure and set your environments. I know in the textbook, Shalido starts to have you set your environments from here on out, and to me that is sort of critical for creating good habits with doing GIS, because it helps you to keep all of your processing consistent. And as I was mentioning a couple slides ago, because rasters take so long to process, I highly recommend that you open a results window, and I show you here how to access this in ArcMap. Because things take so long, sometimes you wonder if your computer forgot about you. Did it go off and have a cup of coffee without you? You can actually see if it's still processing and what stage it's at by running that window. So if you want to go down a fun rabbit hole, I highly recommend watching the video Why Pixels Are Square and Lenses Are Round. Didn't even think that that was a thing, right? The answer might surprise you, because it is entirely arbitrary. And with that, I'll let you guys go. Have a good time with the lab.